Welcome back to UWP on Xbox One. Darren, what's in this session?
In this session, we're going to be talking about the controls that are available for you on your Xbox.
Okay.
So let's jump straight in.
So if I'm a UWP developer, one of the things I'll be concerned about is all the stuff I've taken the time to learn, is it there for me for Xbox One?
And pretty much the same sort of common theme that we've really been talking about. This really is a UWP app that's running on your Xbox. Therefore, you have access to all of the same controls that you would have if you were building a desktop application. So if we look at this particular slide, we can see that we have our various controls. We can see that the controls have headers. They have standard kind of look and feel. They've got a light and dark theme support and everything built in. It is pretty much what you're used to seeing if you're building a desktop application.
So functionally, they really are identical. If you're used to clicking here and this is what happens, or if you're used to a button working like this or laying it out in this sort of way, you're going to be very, very comfortable.
Absolutely. Of course, there's going to be certain idiosyncrasies that we need to deal with, and the next couple of slides will talk through those.
Yeah, I think we should.
So, something that's actually new, not just for Xbox UWP, but for UWP across the entire Windows 10 Anniversary Edition, which I think has been announced as shipping. We have a new set of focus visuals, and these are actually baked into the system itself. So rather than previously where we had what we used to call the marching ants.
Yeah, the little dots.
Yeah. We now have these very solid, and as the name kind of suggests, high visibility visuals that are present across all of the platforms.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is you don't actually have to use them. If you're building your own application and branding it yourself and so on, you may wish to choose to implement your own visual styles. But it does have these things baked into all of the standard controls. It's also, these things are actually properties that are exposed on the controls.
Yeah.
So you can actually fine-tune them and change
without having to retemplate everything.
Exactly. But there is a gotcha there.
Okay.
Good that you mentioned the templating. If you actually retemplate an existing control now,
Like a button.
you actually don't see the focused and unfocused states because they're now being handled by the system. So if you need to style them yourselves, you'll have to add those back into your template.
Okay, so I still can do it. I have to add them back manually, where I used to say copy current, and there they all were, and I would go edit them.
Then you could go and tune them.
Okay. I'm sure they'll have to add those to MSDNs because we'll all forget the exact
I'm
name
sure.
of them. Yeah. Now, because Xbox One is 10 feet away, we need this high visibility. So Xbox kind of drove this, but it's much better as well.
It is actually much more consistent, yeah. And the marching ants, their time is done.
They're marching one by one.
So, one of the things that is unique to the Xbox is this concept of focus traps.
Yeah, focus traps.
Yes. So if we look at this slide, we can see that here we have a slider. And if we were actually using our controller and we're navigating around with the left stick, we'd come to the button 1, we'd hit right, we'd focus on the slider, we'd hit right again, and we'd be on the button.
Oh, I would think you'd hit right again, it'd move the slider.
And so there's the problem, is if we did do that, how would we ever leave the slider? If left and right, once we've focused on the slider...
You'd never get the button 2.
You'd never get the button 2.
Yeah.
And so obviously we had to come up with some sort of mechanism by which to deal with this. So what we've done is we've actually incorporated this idea of focus engagement.
Okay.
So you can elect for certain controls to actually require an engagement action before moving the joystick will actually implement or influence the values. So if we hit the A key, our focus shifts from the slider itself to the thumb. Moving left and right will then interact to control the values, and we would hit B to disengage and move back to our regular focus state. That would then allow us to interact with these controls differently.
And if I were creating my own control, I would want to listen for that A, right, which is easy enough, and then I want to move that focus around. So what I might do is set the items inside my custom control as not able to get focus, and then I programmatically give them the focus that way.
Not is hit test visible or not a tab stop or whatever,
right?
And tweak those things to manually override what the system would do automatically for you. Something else that they've done, again, you mentioned earlier, this is the 10-foot experience, so we're trying to make sure that when we do something on the UI, the user is aware of something occurring.
Sure.
And so one example of this is light dismiss. How do you know you're in a light dismiss mode? where just moving or interacting or hitting B will actually dismiss something.
Yeah.
And so if we look at this particular view here, what we have is we've got a list view. We've actually selected the list view, and we're now engaged in interacting with the list items.
Yeah. But it really does look like it's just floating there, and
Exactly.
it doesn't draw your eye to that
And
list.
a quick glance, you might not necessarily understand that you're in a light dismiss mode. So instead, we now have this subtle effect which fades those elements that are not part of this light dismiss dialog.
Got it. So my pop-up now is the brightest part of the screen.
Exactly. If we go back, we can see that the text and so on is bright. In light dismiss mode, it darkens down.
It's subtle, but it's pretty nice. They introduced this at Build and called it smoke, and you can kind of see why. They just
Yes.
kind of haze everything behind.
Exactly. On other platforms, it might be a blur effect or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
And with UI composition, it could be something that gets added down the line.
And can I programmatically turn this on and off?
Yes, so you have a property that you can set that determines whether it's auto, and it's available on all of the controls that support light dismiss, such as app bar, auto suggest box, and so on.
This isn't unique just to Xbox either. If I start setting this programmatically, I'll see it on Windows, so that's cool.
Yes. So let's show a quick demo of these controls and just prove that there really is nothing different between them and what we're using on our app, on our desktop. So here I have a little controls focus application. So here is a list, just a stack panel with all of my controls. So you can see here's a regular text box, password, we've got auto suggest box, so we can use icons for find and so on within there. We have a slider, so here's a button, a slider, a button. So pretty much a standard UI
Sure.
that you'd expect to see on a desktop. So now let's launch this on our Xbox. So here's our common controls application running on the Xbox, and we can see that we have our focused element. We can see that username is showing as a header. We have our placeholder text is present. If I use my left joystick, I can move down focus,
Oh, that's nice.
and I can move backwards and forwards, so we can see that we have all of the standard inputs. I actually happen to have a controller with a keypad on it, so I can type away.
And did you have to enable that when you're moving up and down with the keypad?
This is all standard navigation. It's just built in. There's no overrides. There's no
Cool.
custom settings. So what we can see here is I'm in an auto suggest, and I have cities listed.
Yeah.
Because we're in a light dismiss scenario, we can see that the other UI has faded. And so I can select an item, come back in.
Everything comes back bright.
Exactly.
Nice.
You can select again. This is the on-screen keyboard. All of those features that we would expect to see.
Mm-hmm.
If I come down to my focus on button 1, as we were talking beforehand about engagement, if I move right, I'm on the slider. If I move left and right, you can see that it doesn't actually engage with that. However, if I click my A button, we now get engaged, and we also get a nice tooltip that shows the value that we're setting, which would obviously be a little bit difficult to see otherwise. I can select A to select the value. I hit B to disengage from the control,
right.
And then I have my regular focus. Here's a button that happens to have a associated flyout. So here's my flyout with amazing content.
Wow. That's nice.
I know, it's pushing the boundaries. And as you can see, we've got light dismiss, so everything's been faded or smoked, as you would say.
Uh-huh.
I can hit B to dismiss from that. Toggle button, so regular states on my toggle button.
Rendering-wise, these look just like normal controls.
Absolutely. They are being scaled up, as we've mentioned in a previous session, that by default will be scaled up by 200%. So again, here's an example of a selection of an item, so I can select that.
Nice.
One idiosyncrasy on this particular build is the focus visual on the Xbox.
Your current setting is of.
Exactly. Is it's actually impinging upon the text of the control. Running on desktop, this doesn't happen, so I expect this to be fixed in a future build of the environment. But again, we can just toggle backwards and forwards. And so there's no real surprises here. This is what we would expect to see.
Well, this is a great time to show off the focus.
Yes.
It is really, there are two parts to the focus. It's the outer black and then the inner white. You can really see them here.
Yes, indeed.
That's nice.
Okay, great.
As you are moving forward and backwards, I know there's a lot of special logic in order to make sure that I can focus on the right control. I think it makes sense for us to talk about what's special about focus in Xbox One, because it is a little different.
Absolutely. So we have out of the box a focus manager that will allow us to navigate around our application if we're laid out in a very logical grid fashion. So In this particular slide here, we've got an element focused on the left here. If I wish to initiate a transition to the right, then the focus manager is going to look to see at the physical layout of these elements and work out, okay, is there something adjacent to this on the right-hand side? It's important to know that the controls have to be tab stop true, and they also have to be visible
that's nice
for them to qualify.
Yeah.
So, if you remove them from the tabbing environment, then they won't gain focus. Once we've moved onto that control, again, if we want to initiate a transition to the right, it's going to look to the right. Now, what we can see is in this particular control, there is nothing to the right.
Yeah.
And so there would be no...
So I could push right all I want here, and it would just not move.
Exactly. And so we then have the ability to turn around and say, okay, if we want to override this, then we can actually specify some additional attributes in XAML, or even in the code behind as well, to turn around and say we wish to set foo XY focus right equals bar. And so that will take it from the control foo to the control bar.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now, even what if there was something else on the right-hand side, but I had set this property?
Then that would override that default transition and always take you to bar.
Okay, that's brilliant. And so XY focus right, you're showing in C#, but I could say XY focus right as an attribute in any element and set it to bar or whatever, and it would go to that when you go to the right.
Absolutely. And of course, there's also focus left, focus up, focus down.
Sure.
Those are also available. It's also important to note that the relationship is not reciprocal. So just because we said a right transition from foo goes to bar doesn't mean that a left transition from bar will go back to foo. In this scenario, it is likely to move to the control below foo.
I think a lot of people looking at this might wonder, well, if I am on bar and I go to the left, what happens next? And we have a demo to kind of help put some answers to these questions.
Exactly. So let's switch to Visual Studio and look at the control focus demo. So here we have the main UI, and we have a grid. And in this grid, we have 4 rows and 4 columns. And in each of those rows, we have 4 buttons that are distributed across those columns.
Okay.
And so they're numbered out. And so right now we have a fully populated 4x4 grid. So if I run this up on my remote machine, okay, so here's our standard environment. So I'm going to hit right, and you can see I'm moving left, and that will automatically move focus. If I hit down, it'll move through the grid. And so all of this will just work. Okay, so that makes sense. Now let's make things a little bit more complicated for the focus manager. So I'm going to comment out the middle 2 buttons in the first row and another button in the second row.
Okay.
So now let's launch this. So here we are, and now we see we've got some buttons missing. If I move right from 0, 0, it jumps across to 0, 3.
Okay.
If I move left, it jumps back to 0, 0 because these are adjacent.
Yeah, that seems
If I'm down on 1.1, 0, if I move right, I go to 1, 2, left to 1, 0. Okay, but say I want to override this. If I go right from 0, 0 and I want to go to 2, 1, how would I go about doing that? Well, I've got a couple of different ways, so let's show you how we do that in Visual Studio. So I'm going to demonstrate the code behind method. And in here, in my code behind of my main page, I've got a setup focus. And here's button 0, and I'm saying on the XY focus right, go to button 2, 1. And on button 1, 0, on XY focus right, go to button 2, 1. So if I now run up the application again.
So this approach is particularly interesting if you know your UI ahead of time. It's going to be a challenge if your data is dynamic.
It is, and you need to plan out those scenarios. Okay, so now we're in. If I move right from 0, 0, go straight down to 2, 1.
Oh, that's cool.
If I go up to 1, 0, go right, it goes down to 2, 1. But notice going left does not take me back to where I came from. It takes me back to the left control. So that's pretty simple and straightforward.
Yeah, that's a nice UI. You would expect for it to do that sometimes.
Exactly. So what would happen if we place something right slap bang in the middle of some of these controls, floating over the top? So if we have a look at the XAML here, what we have at the bottom is I have this crazy button that has been set up to be sitting on top of.
I see, outside of the grid.
It's outside of the grid. It's got a funky margin that's going to position it kind of in the middle. So if I run this, now we get to guess what goes on in terms of focus.
Okay, it's a game.
So here we have our floating button. So if I go right from 0, 0, it's going to go to where we told it to go, 2, 1.
Because we coded that in code behind.
Exactly. Now if I go right from 2, 1, where do we expect to go?
Well, probably the floating button, right?
Exactly, because that is the most rightmost control. So even though it's not part of the grid, even though it's declared outside of the grid and in terms of Z order is above everything else, our focus manager is by default looking at where things physically are on the screen.
I see.
And so it can see that the floating button is the most rightmost after 2, 1, and so that's where it takes us. So now if I move right from there, where do you think I'm going to go?
2, 2?
2, 2. You're feeling good now, huh?
Well, I'm curious. I wasn't sure. Why didn't it go to 1, 2?
Because if you look at the overlap, it's overlapping more of 2, 2 than it is 1, 2.
I see.
And so that is the most right control out of those two.
Okay. And then 2, 2 up?
We go to 1, 2.
All right, that's what I would expect.
If I go left from 1, 2, where am I going to go?
Well, 1, 0? Oh! Did you just go left?
I did just go left. Yeah, I'm not messing with you, Jerry.
All right. So in that case, it's because it is actually overlapping. It is actually there.
And it is to the left of 1, 2.
Even though it's just a little, it's enough.
But this really highlights how important it is to correctly design your UI. Because it's totally reasonable on your part to assume you would go to 1, 0 as well. So this would be confusing for your users. And so obviously you wouldn't want to build a UI like this.
Yeah. I've built many UIs like this.
Yes, you have.
All right, so the big deal around focus inside Xbox One is that it's handled for you, and it looks visually which control is to the left, right, above, and below, and you can handle that. And if you need it to be customized, you can go in and customize everything, so it doesn't do anything like that if it fits your UI. And interestingly enough, what happens if I take a controller like this and plug it into a Windows device like my Surface Book here?
So you can take an Xbox controller and with a USB lead, you can plug it directly into a USB port, or you can get the wireless connector as well. And you then have the ability to test this XY navigation on your existing desktop applications. It's also worth pointing out that the new Xbox One S controller is Bluetooth as well as Wi-Fi.
Don't need the dongle?
So you won't need the dongle.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and that you can also connect that to other tablet devices as well. Okay, so the last thing we wanted to talk about was sounds. So it wouldn't be an Xbox experience if we didn't have all the sounds.
That's right.
You know, and anybody who's used the Xbox over time just intrinsically understands those left, right, up and down sounds. The great thing about the UWP platform is they're built in for us.
So in XAML, it's right there native. JavaScript need to bring those sounds in.
Yeah, and so we also have the ability to actually invoke those sounds ourselves if we're building custom controls and so on. And so if we heard there's our focus sound. Here's our invoke sound. Go back, show, hide, move next.
And I've heard this a zillion times.
Yes, it is part of that oral vocabulary that we've become familiar with the Xbox.
Nice. And so it's all there natively on the controls that come out of the toolbox.
Yep.
And you're saying I can also do it programmatically on the controls that I create custom.
Yeah. An interesting thing is in the current preview, they're not actually enabled, so that will be enabled in a future release.
Okay. Well, we kind of went through the core pieces around UWP controls inside Xbox One. We talked about the fact that we have all the controls we're already used to, that they have the behavior we're already used to, and they render the way they already used to, with a couple of little caveats. One of them is we now have, really not just for Xbox One, for everybody, these new focus visuals. We also have the ability now to handle navigation visually in this new XY focus, which is very powerful. And as you showed us, we also have sounds now, which is cool. We could even put that on. Can you actually have that on the Windows side as well, I wonder?
I haven't tried.
I
haven't tried.
A little experiment.
To try, yes.
Yeah. All right, there you go. This is controls on Xbox One.